was some back noise. Hi, I'm Tim. I work for Zeit, a cloud hosting company based out of San Francisco. But I'm actually from the Netherlands, and I work remotely, as you might have heard from my accent. Anyway, let's dive into what I'm going to talk about today, which is Next.js, which is the React framework. Who here has used React before? Who's still using it? No one else is using Next, but you've probably used Create React app before, I would assume. I see a lot of nods. Okay, it's something like Create React app, but not really. It does a bit more. So let's dive in and take a step back. So generally when you start building web applications, you need some kind of component system, especially if you're building websites or like really large applications. You don't want to have 5 versions of the same button in your app, right? Because you have to go through, like if you make a styling change, you have to change it in every place that you could think of, and you just don't want that, of course. So React helps with this, right? You get components that render based on the input that you give it, props, basically. And React is sort of simple in terms of that if you never used React before, we'll take a step back first, which is a basic React component is just a function in JavaScript that returns some HTML called JSX. It's actually not really HTML, but it's sort of similar. At least it looks like HTML. Nice. So to start building a React app, actually feels a lot like this, where you have to put in all these tools that have to come together, like Webpack and Babel, and I don't know if you want to use Typescript, or for example, you have to set up your compilation in the correct way. You have to make sure that everything's optimized, and it's just really hard to get it right. And that's just to get started. That's not even to go to production. In reality, it's gotten easier, but going to production is still really complex, as I said, because there's frameworks and other tools that help you with setting these things up. So to solve this issue, you need some kind of framework for React that can scale with your project, because typically you want to control the complexity of what you're trying to achieve in some kind of way that makes sure that you're actually successful in shipping to production. And furthermore, React is in a really interesting position because it is very low level, as in you only get the rendering layer and you don't get all the other tools that you need to go to production. So it handles one thing really well, but building the production React apps is still complex. So let's go into a kind of a story. So you start building a static website, maybe a marketing website for your company. And as your project grows, pages are added. So maybe you add in extra pages, or you add in pages with different requirements, which, for example, could be a dashboard or a your manager walks into your workspace and it's like, hey, I want to have an e-commerce part of the website now, and you have to back it by some different dynamic data, for example. But you started your project as a static website, right? So you have to rebuild your app every time you make changes, every time dynamic changes happen also. So really the question is, how can I make my app scale with all these changes that happen in requirements, for example? Similar to going from a monolith to microservices. And also, how can I make my app scale with size? So generally when you start building a React app and you do it all by yourself and you haven't thought of anything else really, you get this single JavaScript bundle, for example. And every time you add in another page or another component, the bundle grows. And as you can see in this graph, this impacts the initial rendering, because client-side rendering in React means that every time to render something, you have to load the JavaScript bundle first. So you get one big bundle of JavaScript, but also one big bundle of CSS. So you need some kind of code splitting. And this grows uncontrollably over the lifespan of your app, as I outlined. So this is where Next comes in, and it makes your app scale with changes from very small websites to larger applications. And it allows you to focus on what's important, which is generally building things or making money building things. Both are fine. You can do both, of course. So let's take a sec back. So what does Next actually do? So you start by creating a pages directory. And this pages directory maps every path that you create in there, like about.js, for example, to a path in your application. So most of you raise your hand saying, oh, I've used PHP before. It's actually really similar to PHP. But what if you want to route, say, a dynamic route, product ID, for example? So all you have to do in Next is create a product directory, and then use this bracket syntax, and put ID in between there, and it will route product/1 to this route that you created. But let's take a step back even further, which is, what is a page? A page is actually just a React component. So you export this React component that I showed you before, and it just works. It will route that /about to this hello world h1. And generally, when you are creating pages or when you're creating web apps, you have to make sure that the trade-offs that you're trying to impose are the correct ones. So the Google Chrome team created this very elaborate graph that shows you which rendering target that you want to use for which cases you're trying to solve. So there's 5 different ones, and it's really hard to read from this, but it's server-side rendering, static server-side rendering, server-side rendering with rehydration, client-side rendering with pre-rendering, and full client-side rendering. And now you can tell me which one you have to choose, right? So the recommendation here is that generally you have to choose which framework you're going to use to do one of these things. Except if you look at the general applications that you're building, generally not just the marketing side or just the dashboard, it's covering all these different items. And even looking at this graph, you're reminded of this tweet where you're looking at this really complex graph of how to do things. So Next actually helps with this in that it allows you to go between these rendering targets in one application. So the first one is pre-rendering. Pre-rendering means static websites. Literally HTML, rendering HTML, and no like dynamic data coming from another source at all. So this means that if you just export, for example, this component, and you run the Next app, this will be static, much like PHP. So this is good for marketing pages, blogs. It works great for SEO because everything is statically rendered. And very fast, of course. But it requires a rebuild to do content updates because static pages can't change, can't be re-rendered without a rebuild of the whole application. Then there is server-side rendering, which means that on demand, when your user comes to a page, the page is rendered. So we actually provide a method here to do data fetching, which is called getInitialProps. Basically like models in a normal MVC type approach, where you can do data fetching and then passing the data into the view. And it's called getInitialProps, and it's an asynchronous method that allows you to fetch from basically anywhere, any data source that you have. And this works for headless CMSs and cases where the data updates frequently. Then there's client-side rendering. So this is generally where you have your typical single-page application where there's no server-side rendering, there's no generation at build time, there's just the rendering after the JavaScript bundle load. And this works for dashboards and internal applications generally. So like classic single-page application. But even if you want to go beyond React, and you don't want to just render React apps, Next allows you to render an additional strategy, which is AMP. I don't know if any of you have heard of AMP. Maybe we can do a show of hands. It's a surprising amount of people. Sometimes I have to very elaborately explain it. But I'll still very elaborately explain it to make sure that everyone understands. It's a framework for building fast web applications. And it's actually a standard for HTML, like a sub-spec of HTML, that makes sure that your app is fast and renders fast. It's generally for websites and blogs and that kind of stuff. But it was started by Google, and as you can see in this image that is shown on the slide, maybe you've seen in Google before, if you go on mobile, you've seen this lightning icon. And this lightning icon means that the page is actually supporting AMP. And what this means is it will load instantly inside of Google, because Google will actually execute the AMP rendered HTML. And yeah, so AMP pages are discovered by search engines and rendered inside of search engines. So currently both Bing and Google support it. And there are two ways to use AMP inside of Next. The first is AMP hybrid, which means you have your normal Next app, and then next to it you render another AMP page. So this works for when you already have your Next app built out, and then you want to build your AMP pages, if you want to opt into it. And then there's AMP first, which means that you opt into AMP, and you use it to render both on desktop and mobile, but also on your main website. And this is being done for mainly performance reasons, like maybe you don't want to load in the general JavaScript for a React app, but you're building like a very static-ish website. This is where AMP can really shine in terms of performance, for example. So all these strategies that I've outlined can be combined into one application, which means that your About page could be pre-rendered and using hybrid AMP, for example. And your dashboard can be client-side rendered. And the product ID can be server-side rendered. So every page has a different strategy. And you can choose per page what you're going to use for your specific use case, unified in a single framework. And so you can go from website to web application to marketing website. So it allows you to build truly hybrid web applications. However, generally you're not just building a front end, right? You're also building some kind of back end. Whereas Full Stack Europe, maybe you do both, maybe you don't, but in general you always have a back end in some way. For example, a contact form that has to be submitted. So you need a backend to handle your data requirements, for example, like the form for the contact form. So generally, when you start building a JavaScript-based API endpoint, you create a separate project next to your web app, right? And then you install your web server. You create an endpoint. You run your server on a different port, because it can't run on the same port, of course. And every time you make a change, you have to restart your server. Because if you forget to restart your server, you can make all the code changes that you want, but you never see the updates. So you need an API server that can scale with your project, because what if you have hundreds of these different endpoints? Like you have a microservices architecture. At Zeit, we have 300 microservices. And that means that you have 300 different repositories with 300 different ports that you have to run it on if you want to run everything locally. And that's just not going to work, generally. Because you have to manage it all locally and then like force conflict and all those other things. So you need some API server that can actually handle all this for you automatically. And the fun thing is that you can actually create API endpoints inside of Next. So you don't need a custom server, you don't need to set up anything else, but you still preserve all the scaling and API characteristics that you had with microservices, for example, and I'll go into this later. So creating an API endpoint is quite simple. It's similar to just the Pages approach. Inside of Pages, you create an API directory, and inside of the API directory, you create contact.js, for example, which references /contact or /API/contact. So what does one of the API endpoints look like? It's just an Express handler, sort of. We're not using Express inside of Next, but we've made sure that all the APIs that you would generally use in an Express app are there for you to use in a more optimized way. So there are middlewares that are included by default, which is, for example, requested query, requested body, this body parsing for both normal forms, so URL encoded forms, or JSON payloads. Or requested cookies, for example, for the cookies that come with the request. And API endpoints are updated as you make changes. I'll have to look there, I guess. Let's try that. Okay, I can look there. That's nice. So if you make changes to your app, which is say you change, for example, the hello.js inside of the API directory, and you curl it, which just gives back hello right now. And you change the actual API, and you change it to hello world, and then you save it, so you don't make any changes. And then you curl again. What you see is it's actually automatically updated, hot reloaded, as we say. Now, if you use PHP, you might be like, what is this guy talking about? I've done this forever. If you use Node.js before, or JavaScript in general, this is like a really revolutionary thing. Magic, no. But yeah, so that all just works automatically. You get the PHP experience with Next without doing anything special. So your frontend is so now your frontend is just a frontend plus an API, and they're handling data. So you can't afford it to break, because if you lose customers that are interested in your project, for example, because your contact form is broken, you have a problem, right? So generally, how can you avoid bugs in your applications? And this is where TypeScript comes in. And TypeScript is a subset of JavaScript that allows for static type checking. And with Next, it's actually automatic by just adding in tsx or .ts. So you don't have to set up anything else to get started with using TypeScript in the Next app. And you can gradually adopt it. If you're, say, already using JavaScript, but you want to switch to TypeScript more granularly, it will allow you to just change certain pages. And so when you change that extension, it will actually set up your tsconfig, all the configuration needed to start doing the compilation for TypeScript. So there's no need for a tsconfig. It will also fill the build and give you type errors in development automatically. And on top of that, the Next.js core is written in TypeScript, which means that you get very elaborate types for all the Next.js core modules when you use them. So you can see all the props, all the you can see errors if you use the wrong props, for example, on a React component. And in that way, it makes sure that you're more successful and write less bugs, hopefully. And then there's the last concept, which is you want to deploy to production, right? So when you take a Next app and you want to take it to production, you have to find some kind of Node.js hosting and run the build and run Next start, which is basically our production boot up. So as you can see in the slide, I just ran yarn build, which runs Next build, which creates an optimized production build for your Next app. So every page becomes a separate file. that is then, you basically see all the size information, because it's also client-side JavaScript. And it makes sure that you are aware of all the changes that you make inside of your app. So there's two targets to deploy in Next. The first one is the server target, which is actually quite simple. You take pages, they're built into a server, and that server is a Node.js server, and you boot it up, and you're done, basically. However, this has some upsides and some downsides. The upsides are, and it's only one upside, it's really easy to deploy. You put it in some like container system or on a Node.js hosting platform, and it just works. The downsides are that it's really hard to scale to many users, because you only get one instance of this Node.js app running, and you have to set up all this other scaling infrastructure to make sure that everything stays online. So it's always running, and all the work happens inside of the same process, which means that if multiple requests come in, it can actually give negative results in terms of that one request could block another request. So then there is the serverless target, which is a more optimized target that we created that allows you to basically build the next step into separate serverless functions. And the serverless target also has some upsides and some downsides. And they're basically the opposite of the server target, which is you can scale to many users, which is great. We all want to make sure that your app never goes down. You can run it on demand, which means that you're not paying for servers to be running. And it's separated per page, so you get scaling on a granular level. The downside is it's really hard to deploy. You have to create all these separate serverless functions and some extra infrastructure to make that all work. So the serverless target looks like this. It outputs a separate bundle that is just taking in request and response from Node.js, and it renders the page and ends the request. So why is it hard to deploy if it looks like this? So generally, you need to wrap this into a compat layer for, say, AWS Lambdas or Google Cloud Functions or Azure Functions. And to make that work, you have to set up extra build tooling. And also write the extra build tooling, because it doesn't exist exactly. So at Zeit, we're a hosting company, as I said in the beginning. We actually built a hosting platform for Next.js apps, which is it's quite simple. You run now, and it just takes care of everything for you. It puts it into production, like you get a unique URL for every now deployment that you do. And it sets up HTTPS, it sets up a CDN, it's built into the framework, into the platform. And it just takes care of all the hassle around setting up web hosting. So it has a CDN built in many locations around the world. And it makes sure that your app is fast around the world. So all the static assets are automatically served through its CDN. And it also has a Git integration that gives you a unique URL for every commit that you do and every push that you do to a pull request, for example. And it works with both GitHub and GitLab, and soon also Bitbucket. So Next can scale from a very small website to a very large project. So on the left-hand side is my personal website, which unfortunately doesn't get that many visitors. I can't make anything better out of it, right? But then on the other hand, on the right side is Hulu, which is a very large streaming service that is currently available in the US. And that generates their own content very similar to other very large streaming services. But Nexus is not just used by Hulu, it's being used by thousands of really large companies and small companies also. Like, it goes from startups to really large companies. For reference, we're currently in a Hilton hotel, Hilton.com. You might have, maybe if you're staying here, you might have used Hilton.com to book your hotel room. It's built on top of Next.js, for example. But also parts of GitHub are using it, parts of Zillow, Eurostar trains, etc. So it goes from a personal website to really large companies. And specifically with Hulu, we did a separate case study that you can see on this URL. And to learn more about Next.js, you can go to nextjs.org/learn to go through an interactive tutorial on how to get started with Next.js. Thank you very much.